Now it's working. Mine's lit too. Okay, cool. Great. Alrighty, folks. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. So the plan for today is to pick up where we left off last time. Recall what we were doing. It was a sort of tour de force through what I call the basic terms and concepts, which is material that I would ordinarily cover, as I said, in probably 2 weeks, in a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe even a little longer than that. But since most folks here, not everyone here is an upper level student, I've tried to go kind of quickly through it. And I want to get back on that. And the reason why is because some of the language that I'm using isn't exactly standard. I try to use standard language whenever I can, but for some of the concepts that we'll be making use of, I've co-opted language from Feldman or other sources. I want to make sure we're on the same page as to how I'm going to be describing arguments. That's important. And also, I hope that to reinforce this throughout the course, right, we'll go back and be looking eventually at individual arguments, and I'd like for you to be able, for example, in your discussion post or in your final paper, to use this terminology so that even if it seems obvious to you, it's good for me as an instructor to see you using this stuff in your post and in your final paper, describing an argument as a valid argument, explaining what that means, or an inductive argument, we'll call those cogent arguments, and explaining that, and so on. So I want to pick back up with that. Also, I've looked at the pretest. If you haven't taken the pretest, then, and this goes for online folks as well, then please do so because that helps me. And I've looked at which questions were the easiest and which were missed most often. And so I thought we'd take a look at least a couple of the ones that people missed the most, trying to figure out what's going on there. I suspect some of it is just unfamiliarity with the terminology that I'm using in my basic terms and concepts notes. Then also getting into Chapter 1. So I've read through the discussion post, the introductory post. I appreciate you introducing yourselves. In-class people did it face-to-face. Online folks did it in the discussion board, so thank you for that. Then I've also read through Discussion 1, the first real discussion concerning Chapter 1, and Feldman's approach to epistemology. And I found it really interesting. I hope it'll continue in that vein. So if you haven't posted for whatever reason, then please do so, because you'll get credit for it. If it's extremely late, like past the time that we've already discussed the relevant discussion topic, then there'll be some reduction in how much credit you get for it, but something's better than nothing in these situations. So please do post if you haven't, as well as for our online folks. And there was some good discussion there. I thought it was really interesting to see what people are saying about the different sort of stances that one could take at the outset, and we'll talk some about that. Depending on how far we get today, and I don't know ahead of time how that's going to go, the plan would be for next time to start talking about Chapter 2, and I've already opened, should be out there, the second discussion board. So you can go ahead and post on that an initial response if you like, and I'll be reading those as well. In general, with the discussion boards, the way I do it is I try not to comment myself. I feel like those are really they're for you guys. That's an opportunity for you to interact with your classmates and to do some philosophy outside of the classroom setting. So the fact that I'm not posting something to every single thing someone says doesn't mean that I'm not paying attention. I am. I'm out there. And certainly if I see something that for whatever reason inspires me or motivates me or some point that I want to make, then I can do that. But in general, I think it's good for you to know so that you kind of have some expectation of what the weekly discussion boards are going to look like. They're really for you guys. As always, I'll be at Tate Street Coffee today and Thursday immediately following our meeting. I go downstairs to my office here and regroup and then walk to Tate Street. So if anybody does need to meet with me, that's a good time to do so. If you can't make that time for any reason, shoot me an email and we'll find another time that works. Still really early in the semester, so probably not a huge demand for that, but wanted to at least remind folks. So questions from you guys before we get back into it? All right, great. So quick review before I put some stuff up on the projector just to sort of get back to where we were. Somebody remind us, let's just do it quickly, the basic sources, at least as Feldman sees them. Somebody give me one of them. See if we can do it from memory here.
Rational insight.
Okay, I can't. So rational insight, yeah, we got that. How about a perception? Yeah, yeah, Ian. Introspection, yeah. Yeah. Reasoning, yeah. Testimony, great. We got them all. I think there's one more. Memory, good, yeah. So we got all of those. And we talked a little bit about that, right, last time. Then I started talking about what I'm calling the objective theory of truth. I abbreviated OTT, and the one truth value principle. As I said, they're often in the literature and discussions you'll see it referred to as the correspondence theory of truth. Probably a more philosophical sort of label for it. But in any case, somebody want to take a stab at reminding us all what does the objective theory of truth or the correspondence theory of truth say truth is? Yeah, thanks. Ethan.
Truth is corresponding with reality.
Yeah, and I say thanks, I appreciate it, with the facts, right? And of course a natural question, although it didn't really come up last time, is, well, what are the facts? Whose facts are we talking about? What about facts that are socially constructed? What about, are we supposed to just be committed ontologically to the existence of a realm of facts out there? I didn't say much about that on purpose because it's a thorny issue. The way I think about it is that the world is fixed in various respects, various parameters, and our language is, at least in many cases, right, an attempt to characterize or describe that reality. Insofar as our language succeeds in doing that, then the statements or propositions, I'll use that language interchangeably, those things are accorded the value true. Insofar as they fall short of that, then they're false. But I don't mean to suggest that this is easy, and certainly a lot of questions come up in connection with thinking about this correspondence view. And last time I briefly kind of outlined some puzzles, right? So if you take a statement like, the cup is on the table, that proposition referring to my Tate Street coffee cup and this table, then I think most of us would say, yeah, that statement's true. And what makes it true is this actual state of affairs, this concrete arrangement. You might call this the truth maker or the fact in the world, right? It's a physical, concrete, presumably arrangement of stuff, whatever cups and tables turn out to be metaphysically. But that's an easy one, and we can observe it, can perceive it, we can sort of agree about that one, let's suppose. But there are a lot of other examples, right? So we considered statements involving mathematics, statements involving consciousness, somebody thinking a certain thought, statements of logic, statements involving things like morality and religious claims or claims of the supernatural, right? So it's not always obvious what the corresponding fact in the world would be or the truth maker would be. One approach would be to say, well, we just have to expand our ontology, our theory of what there is or what exists in order to accommodate and make room for facts of that sort. Or you might try to hang on to those facts by making them true out of existing states of affairs, rearrangements of existing things. Or you might just say, well, look, I'm skeptical that there are any facts of the relevant sort, and so I'm skeptical about those kinds of claims. Some different ways you could go there. So the objective theory of truth, a statement's true if and only if it corresponds to the facts the way the world is. The one truth value principle, what about that one? Let's see if people remember this stuff. What's the basic idea there? Can a statement be true and false at the same time? Or true and not true, right? So it can't no, principle of non-contradiction, right? And what about some third value? What about indeterminate? A statement's being indeterminate in its truth value, or having some probabilistic, something within an interval from 0 to 1, or vague, yeah. Right, thanks, Ethan. Yeah, so again, these are classical assumptions, and they can be challenged, and they have been challenged. I don't mean to suggest that all this is set in stone, as most of you know by now, if you've taken a fair amount of philosophy. For virtually any philosophical claim a person makes, there's going to be some smart philosopher somewhere who's going to disagree with it and try to show you where you go wrong. And that's just the nature of the discipline. But it's an assumption that I'm making and that Feldman makes in his work, so it's worth worth discussing. So last time we talked about deductive arguments and inductive arguments and what it is for an argument to be valid, right? And it turns out, interestingly, that one of the questions that people, about 50% of the class missed was, I thought, a pretty simple question involving the concept of a valid argument. And so I'm curious to see what people say when I bring that up. But in any case, someone remind us, right? The way I'm thinking about things is that arguments fall into, and this is just on the side of form. And so up here, I've got some projected material. If I stand over here, maybe people in the online shell can see what's going on. So at the top level, we've got arguments. They divide into the well-formed and the ill-formed ones. The well-formed arguments for us are the valid arguments, and the inductive arguments, which I'm calling cogent. So I suspect that some of the questions people missed had to do with not being familiar with how I'm using that word. There's been no standard, as far as I can tell, among philosophers for what we should call good inductive reasoning from a formal standpoint, right? And so sometimes the word cogent gets used to mean something different. But in any case, this is all on the side of the form of an argument, right? So somebody remind us, what makes a valid argument valid? Yeah, Corey? Yeah, but say some more. I mean, that sounds like it's on the right track, but yeah, Jamie? Thanks. Yeah, that's what I was looking for, that part. But yeah, you were probably headed down that path. So important to keep that in mind. Again, this is like a foundational concept, right? I mean, if there's one thing I really want my students to come away from a philosophy course knowing, it's at least what a valid argument is. So an argument's valid if and only if it's impossible for all of its premises to be true while its conclusion is false, right? Another way of saying that is that it's a necessary truth that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So bear that in mind. All right, so that gets us pretty much to where we were in the basic terms and concepts material. Down here near the bottom, right, talking about these inductive arguments. So it would be nice if we could do everything deductively, and that's sort of a philosopher's fantasy, I suppose, to do it that way. But as you know, it seems like we can't do that. We need a way of talking about, characterizing, and evaluating good arguments that are not deductive arguments, right? So how do we do that? Well, I borrow this label here of cogent to describe arguments that satisfy the following two conditions. They're not valid arguments, but they are arguments where if their premises were true, then the conclusion would probably be true, right? So think about that for a second. And what I mean by probably here is more than 50%, but less than a probability of 1. So if I say most people in this classroom are not teachers, right? And I pick a random person, say Anthony, right? And you know nothing more than that he's in the classroom. If those premises were true, in other words, if most people in the classroom are not teachers and Anthony's in the classroom, then it seems like it's reasonable to believe that he's probably not a teacher, right? But there's no guarantee, right? Suppose it turns out, unbeknownst to all of us, that he's also doing student teaching somewhere. And another way that you can see it is just imagine that you substitute me instead of Anthony. Let me be the subject there. So you could say most people in this room aren't teachers. Rick's a person in the room. Therefore, probably Rick's not a teacher, but I am a teacher, right? I'm the instructor. So that's just a kind of generic form way of thinking about these inductive arguments and how I'm going to be thinking about them. That's on the formal side, right? So where do we go from there? Well, we have to think about, we know that there's more to being a good argument than just being deductively valid or being inductively cogent, right? Because we have to take into consideration the content side of things, which is the premises. Are the premises reasonable for you to believe, right, based on some standard of rationality? And this takes me to the second page of my basic terms and concepts overheads. These are all on Canvas for the online folks, so feel free to take a look at those there. So I don't have it listed here, but in the pretest I had, I think, at least one question about an argument being a sound argument, and a bunch of people got that wrong too. Anybody remember, since we've got folks that recently took Logic 310, what is a sound argument by definition? Come on, you 310 folks. Yeah.
It's a valid as well as alternative and true.
Thanks. Yeah, exactly. So by definition, a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. And you can just tell from the definition then that the conclusion of any sound argument must be true, right? Because a valid argument is one where if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true, and we're saying the premises are actually true. So the conclusion of any sound argument is going to be true. I don't have that concept listed up here, and the reason for that is twofold. First of all, there are a lot of cases, especially in philosophy, where you can't tell whether all the premises are true, right? So for in everyday life, some non-philosophical matter, it might not be problematic. But with our subject, any field in philosophy, there are going to be a lot of arguments. In fact, the most interesting, fun arguments are often the ones where there's lots of disagreement about one or more of the premises. So if you're trying to evaluate an argument, you've got it reconstructed, premise 1 through 5 or 7 or whatever, and you've got some conclusion, and you say, okay, this is a valid argument. That's good. It's got the good structure, one way of being good, right? Or it's a cogent argument. Are all the premises true? Well, inevitably, there's going to be some breakdown, right? Somebody's going to say, well, I'm not sure about premise 4, or I don't know if premise 2 is true. There's some doubts about this. And things can grind to a halt, right? So the idea of being able to say definitively, hey, this is a sound argument or not a sound argument, that's often something we can't do. In order to get around that, I use this notion of a strong argument, which is a little bit different. The idea is that we don't have to be able to say decisively, definitively, that all of the argument's premises are true in order to be able to evaluate that argument. All we have to be able to do is to say whether or not all the premises are justified for you to believe right now. Okay? So the first condition of being a strong argument is it's got to be either valid or cogent. All right? Here's a second motivation for using this notion of a strong argument for a person rather than the traditional notion of a sound argument. Notice that soundness, by definition, only applies to deductive arguments, to valid arguments. But not all of the arguments we're going to want to consider are going to be valid, right? Feldman has 2 chapters on induction and inductive reasoning and Hume's problem and the new riddle of induction. So we're going to be talking about that, right? One worry is whether or not our inductive reasoning is justifiable or any good. So we need to have some sort of a label, some sort of a concept that allows us to evaluate both deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. The concept of a sound argument won't do that. So two sort of motivations then for introducing this idea of an argument being strong for a person. One, that this notion is broader. It applies to deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And then secondly, it gets around this sort of dilemma of, well, what do you do when you can't say for sure whether all the premises are true? So an argument's a strong argument for a person at a time. I suppress the time index in most of these things because it's less wordy. If and only if, one, it's either valid or cogent, which means its form is either one that guarantees the truth of its conclusion or makes its conclusion probable, right? And then 2, all the argument's premises are justified for the person at that time, the person evaluating the argument. Other questions might arise if you take it beyond just the person doing the evaluating, right? I mean, so one hot topic right now for a while has been, can there be reasonable disagreements? A lot of folks are fond of saying, well, reasonable people can disagree. We can all still respect each other's views and get along, and there's space for that. But that itself has kind of been challenged, this idea that there could be, that somebody's got to be right and somebody's got to be wrong. So what if I evaluate an argument and I say, hey, it's a valid argument, all the premises are justified, I think it's a strong argument, you should accept the conclusion, and then Derek says, hey, wait a minute, I agree it's a valid argument, but I don't think I'm justified in believing premise 4. So I'm going to say this is not a strong argument. This is a weak argument. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, what was your 2? You said all arguments, premises are what?
So yeah, all the arguments, premises are justified, rationally justified for the person who's evaluating the argument. So to this point, there's my approach, and it's sort of, I think, modeled on Feldman's a bit here, is to think of my primary interest here is trying to decide what I should believe about an argument. So I'm presented with an argument. I want to know whether I should accept its conclusion. What you should do with that argument, that's your call, right? I can't tell you what to think about an argument. I see my role as sort of like your guide, your tour guide or your leader through the terrain here. But at the end of the day, you have to evaluate these arguments yourself and decide what you believe, right? That's to me part of what's great about philosophy. Different philosophers have different takes on things, right? So in any case, there's a kind of egocentric approach built into the way I think about argument evaluation. Now, having said that, in a lot of cases when you're evaluating an argument, like in a classroom setting, I'll put an argument up, premises leading to a conclusion, and we'll go through the argument together, and there'll be discussion, and I want to hear what people have to say, right? Because I may think that the argument's better than you think it is, or you may think it's better than I do, and so by having that discussion, that all then becomes part of our joint body of evidence, of information, if you will, that has to be brought to bear when we evaluate the argument. So even though it may seem it starts off in a kind of egocentric way with just me trying to decide what I think about an argument, because we're in this kind of communal setting, that feedback plays into it. So there is a way to kind of have outside correction or outside information make a difference if somebody's worried that, well, I'm not sure about this approach. So this leads to the next thing I want to talk about. We're getting close to the end of the basic terms and concepts, which is good. I've done this faster, I think, than I've ever done it. To the last little bit, you'll notice that the second condition for an argument being a strong argument is that all the premises be rationally justified for the person who's evaluating the argument. What does that mean? What do we mean by rational justification, right? So I have 2 principles here. The belief principle, abbreviated BP, and then a principle that I'm calling evidentialism that'll get spelled out in more detail as we go further into the subject of the course. But I think of these as kind of the twin principles governing rational belief, in the same way that OTT and OTV are my kind of default principles when it comes to truth, right? So a statement's true if and only if it corresponds to the facts, whatever those things turn out to be. And no statement can be both true and not true, and there's no other alternative than true or not true. We've got sort of 2 principles there governing truth, and then the corollaries would be the belief principle and evidentialism. So now we're thinking about belief, not truth. And this is a kind of thing that I really try to sort of beat into the heads of my intro students, to separate your thinking about truth from your thinking about belief, evidence, reasons, arguments, consensus, verifiability, all intersubjective testability. All these different things that we care a lot about are well worth our time, and we're going to think about them, but they're not the same thing as truth according to this kind of traditional view, right? So truth is its kind of own thing, and then here we come along as agents in the world trying to figure out what the truths are, right? And we do that using the various sources of knowledge, right, that we've already discussed a little bit. Most of them are fallible, as we said last time, but from time to time, hopefully we get things right, and we thereby come to know things about the world, right? So let me say a little bit about the belief principle and evidentialism. The belief principle is a descriptive principle. It's not a normative principle, and this is terminology that's worth me saying just a little bit about, since it gets used in other areas of philosophy as well. You've probably heard the word normative if you've taken some ethics courses here with different folks in the department. That word means something different in philosophical circles than it does outside of philosophy. So outside of philosophy in the social sciences, for example, you might hear the word normative, and that means some statistical thing, right? Or the norms in force, like whatever it is that most folks do, or what would be considered within the range of appropriate, behavior, and so on. In philosophy, normative is contrasted with descriptive, and normative principles are principles that tell us what we should or ought to do. They have an evaluative component. That's the key difference, right? So this idea of distinguishing descriptive from evaluative. So I can describe, just to use a kind of mundane, worn-out example, my Tate Street coffee cup here. I can describe it in lots of ways. I can say that it's 10 years old, probably. This is scary. It's green. It's on this table. It's got water in it, right? It has a certain shape and size and mass and so on. These are all just, facts, descriptive facts about the cup. But if I were to go on and say, and by the way, it's my favorite cup, or it's a great cup, as cups go, it's my favorite mug, that would be to kind of evaluate it, right? To give it a certain an appraisal. So the belief principle is intended as a purely descriptive epistemic principle. It just tells us what our options are. And if at any point, I know this is a lot of lecturing, and I'm hoping I'll do less of this as the course moves forward. If you have a question or something seems weird or confused or you're not sure, just comment. By all means, raise your hand and stop me. So what the belief principle says is that when you're considering a statement or proposition, there are exactly three options that you can choose from. You have to do exactly one of the three following things when it comes to a doxastic attitude. This is a fancy piece of terminology that I try to include some of this stuff when it seems appropriate and good for people to know. Doxastic attitudes. So from the Greek word doxa, of or pertaining to belief, a doxastic attitude is an attitude concerning belief. Belief, disbelief, suspension of judgment. So what the belief principle says is that for any person who's considering a statement or proposition at a given time, he or she has exactly one of the following three attitudes to choose from. You either believe that the proposition is true, you believe that the proposition isn't true, which is the same thing as disbelief, believing that it's not the case, right? Or you neither believe that it's true nor believe that it's not true. In other words, you don't believe or disbelieve, you suspend judgment. This is the sitting on the fence kind of position. Notice that unlike the one truth value principle, right, that governs truth, that says, look, when it comes to truth, it's either true or it's not true. With belief, things are a little bit different. So when it comes to these propositional attitudes, intentional attitudes, cognitive states that you can take with respect to a proposition, it seems like you've got an option, at least so far as belief goes. You can believe, you can disbelieve, or you can suspend judgment. Right? People often, say different things about suspension of judgment, depending on the circumstances. I think sometimes people find it frustrating. Often there's maybe felt pressure, at least when it comes to certain controversial matters, to kind of make up your mind and decide, do you either believe it or you disbelieve it. But it does seem like, at least from a theoretical standpoint, there are cases, hypothetical, but I think actual ones as well, where suspending seems to be the appropriate response. Anybody think of one? Something that's not controversial, where it seems like the appropriate attitude to take toward a given statement is to suspend judgment. Yeah, thanks, Ian.
Obviously, like you just being introduced to some idea or concept and you don't know much about it yet, and you just being given an introduction, it's not really acceptable to make a decision on it or judge it just based on, I don't know enough about it to make a
Thanks.
decision.
Yeah. No, that seems right. So, I mean, basically, if you just don't have enough information, right? I mean, you're a novice. You're not an expert yet, and and it seems like a reasonable thing to say, well, hey, I want to hear more about all the different possibilities before I make up my mind. So I'm not going to form a belief one way or the other. All of this discussion, of course, sidesteps a lot of hard questions about belief and voluntarism concerning belief. So in other words, to what extent, if any, are beliefs up to our individual control? In other words, do you choose what to believe or not? That's again a topic that has gotten a lot of attention in the literature and epistemology, and as you can imagine, there's lots of debate about it. Seems like in some cases, at least, your beliefs are not up to sort of immediate direct voluntary control, right? I mean, you're believing right now that the projector is on. If I say, can you willy-nilly get yourself to believe that it's not right now, it'd be pretty hard to do, I think. You might say, well, yeah, I can do it, but very, very difficult to believe that. If I were to suddenly turn the projector off, then presumably you'd find yourself with the belief that the projector is off. Likewise with flipping the switch on the wall for the lights. So I'm setting those questions about doxastic voluntarism and control over one's beliefs, setting those off to the side because they complicate things a lot. But for right now, at least, thinking about cases where it would be appropriate for you to suspend judgment. Suppose I take a quarter out of my pocket, and if I'd been planning ahead better, I would have brought the quarter, and I flip it. It's a fair coin, right, heads and tails, and it lands, and I look at it, and then I put it back in my pocket. So I know which way it landed, but none of you do. And I say, okay, now consider the proposition the coin landed heads. You're considering it. You understand what that statement says, right? It's in a language you understand, and you're currently focused on it. So all those caveats are in place. What should you believe about that? Well, your evidence concerning the way it landed is you have none, right? Well, you know if it didn't land heads, it must have landed tails. So consider that the coin didn't land heads. What should you think about that one? Well, again, same situation. So it seems like in that case, the attitude that is most appropriate in that situation is to suspend judgment about which way the coin landed. Notice, though, that there is a fact, at least in this made-up example, that it either landed heads or it didn't land heads. So by suspending judgment, you'll never gain knowledge, right? Assuming that truth is a component of knowledge. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah, Corey.
This might be a little weird, but I'm trying to think of like something like, so you know the bus times, and you know the bus is going to pick you up, like it says there, hey, the bus will be here at 11:45 and then 12:15.
Right.
And your evidence is that you don't have, like, this is the first time you're taking it, you don't have any evidence about if this is, like, the bus is on time or not.
Right.
Would that be one of, like, so you're not fully justified in, like, what you have in believing that the bus will be on time? So that would be another situation.
Yeah.
Based on evidence, you should suspend judgment, or?
Yeah, good. So the idea is that you haven't. So you know what the schedule says. It's supposed to be here at 11:15, but you don't have any history with this particular situation. How justified are you in that belief?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, presumably the fact that the schedule says that's when the bus is going to be there, if that's all the information that you've got, I guess it depends on where you live. I mean, just kidding. Yeah, I mean, some folks are more skeptically inclined than others, right? Just in everyday life. I mean, I think some of it's a temperament thing, and there may or may not be a lot of philosophy behind it, right? Just like some people are more cautious and risk adverse, and some people are more sort of daring and willing to take on a certain amount of risk, a calculated risk. I think it's a great example. Now, it'd be different if you've been taking this bus for 15 years, and it's only been late twice, and that was when it was a really bad snowstorm and, whatever, right? And the weather's good. So there you've got a lot more information to go on, and so it seems like you're justified, certainly more justified, in believing that the bus will be on time. It'll be there at 11:15. Derek.
Well, I was going to say the same thing.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Awesome. We're on the same page. Good deal. Does that help? Because, I mean, you might also be wondering, well, am I even justified at all in believing, like, am I justified? And I guess my own take on that is that, yeah, I mean, I'm prima facie justified in believing that it'll be there, even though it's just my first attempt, because, there's some not law-like regularities, regarding the reliability of the bus and its schedules, but it just seems as if there's some prima facie justification, unless I've got a good reason. Now, if I'm standing there and the person next to me says, this bus is always late, okay, well, now things have changed, right? I mean, presumably they've got more experience with this, and so what they just said now becomes part of my evidence. But these are all good questions, yeah. So I guess, would it be appropriate to suspend judgment just looking at the schedule alone? I would say no. But these are kind of armchair judgments. So to the second principle here, we've talked about the belief principle. Everyone, whenever you're considering a proposition, you believe, you disbelieve, you suspend, right? Does that seem right to folks? Hopefully. I mean, if you disagree, that's okay, because that's what part of this is all about. But notice, as far as the belief principle goes, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just says, here are your options. You can believe, you can disbelieve, or you can suspend. So a few more little remarks about that before I go to the next one here. Notice that it doesn't say you're stuck with your choice. And that's a good thing, because we want our beliefs to be responsive and sensitive to changes in the information that we have available, right? So, if you suppose you've got a certain amount of information, your bus example is a good one. You've got the schedule. The schedule says 11:15, nothing else to go on. Okay, I'm going to tentatively believe that the bus is going to be there at 11:15, or maybe not tentatively. Maybe you're going to go all in and say, I got a good feeling about this one, or whatever it is, right? Then the person next to you says, oh, by the way, this thing has a horrible track record. Okay, well, now things have changed. So you went from a prima facie justified belief about the bus's arrival time to now that takes away, right? That undercuts it a little bit. So now